Hello, everybody. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast by Joel Haas of the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian football editor. Excited, Joel. It is finally football week. Penn State faces West Virginia at high noon down at Mountaineer Field at Milan Puskar Stadium in Morgantown. It's going to be a rowdy scene. Are you excited for your first trip down there for a game?
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. Looking forward to the atmosphere there and everything like that. Obviously, it's a noon game, so maybe not, as raucous as it might have been for a night game, but still sounds like it's a sellout. I don't think there are any tickets really available. We heard from James Franklin at media actually that they were having difficulty with getting tickets for like alumni and things like that, I believe, just because of how many people are already attending the game. So it should be a great atmosphere. And yeah, just looking forward to making the trip down there for the first time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that atmosphere. We're going to talk about the matchup itself, some of the key players, some of the things we saw last year. How will those matchups play out this year? Also going to get into Pat Kraft's extension a little bit as athletic director. I think there's some interesting topics to get to there before we wrap up. Before we get into that conversation, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, Voodoo Brewing Company in State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC State College has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, but this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football all day. We finish off Sundays with our brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you all at the Voodoo Brewing Company State College Pub. Okay, Joel, let's get into this environment. How do you think it factors in here? I know James Franklin spent a decent chunk of time talking about how the entire state of West Virginia can rally around the Mountaineers, that they don't want to leave any play sheets around at the hotels, lest they end up in the hands of Neil Brown and that coaching staff. And we just know that it's one of the rowdier scenes in college football. We also know Penn State has gone into some tough road environments early in the season in recent years. Thinking of Purdue in that season opener 2 years ago. Maybe Purdue, if you play them in November, is not a tough road trip, but that was a packed stadium, Ross-Ade Stadium that night. Those Purdue fans were geeked for that night game season opener. So that was a tough environment. Then you go into Auburn later, a couple weeks later, end up beating them badly, but that was a tough environment. Even going further back, I think you had that night game against Pitt in 2018 at Acrisure Stadium. And Penn State's shown an ability to be ready for these moments early in seasons. Do you expect anything different heading down to Morgantown?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you look at how the game played out last year with Penn State winning by 23 points, and then you look at the spread this year, and I think it opened around 10 points, and it's actually been bet down to around 8 points now. So it seems like Vegas at least is expecting a much closer game this year, and I think a lot of that does have to do with the environment that we're going to experience in Morgantown. So I think it'll be interesting to see, and obviously the teams been talking about that. They're preparing for a pretty loud environment. Franklin has talked about it. A lot of the players have mentioned specific things that they're kind of doing as they prepare for that. So yeah, no, I do expect it to be a really loud, really aggressive environment there in Morgantown. I think their fans are very excited for this matchup. You kind of look back through West Virginia's history. It's been a long time since they've had a game this big, a team this big, a top 10 opponent coming in. So they're definitely excited for the game. If you interact with any of the West Virginia fans on social media, on Twitter, which I wouldn't recommend doing, but if you have done that, you've certainly heard the jokes, the West Virginia by 2 touchdowns, the Drew Allar, things like that. I don't know how much you're familiar with that, but even just yesterday, I went to Penn State practice and was just posting, some basic clips, some passes from Drew Allar, things like that. And I had West Virginia fans coming at me in the comments talking about how, Penn State was going to start 0-1 and things like that. And I'm just trying to get some videos out from practice and things like that. So it's interesting how passionate, how amped up they are for this matchup. I think they'll be there. I think they'll show up. They'll be ready. They'll be loud. So definitely something to factor in. But like you mentioned, Penn State's no stranger to to starting on the road, to starting in hostile environments. Franklin talked about that a little bit at media after practice. He said he can thank the Big Ten for preparing Penn State for this matchup, constantly scheduling them with road openers and conference play. So I do think Penn State has enough experience in situations like this that they should be ready. Again, Drew Allar's first career appearance came against Purdue when Sean Clifford went down with a little bit of an injury there to open the third quarter. So Allar has experience with things like that, playing in big environments, the horseshoe, everything like that. So I do think that the team should be pretty prepared for it, just given kind of its history. And there are a lot of veteran leaders on this unit who have experienced environments like that before. But again, you don't want to dismiss it because we've seen how much an environment can impact a game, whether it's, the Penn State Mo Bamba against Michigan, whether it was Iowa against Penn State in 2021. We know how much these college football environments can really play a factor. So obviously you can't, take anything for granted, and you really have to be aware of how much of an impact the fans can have on this game.
Yeah, we've seen Pat McAfee feeding the fire as well. And I think the fact that the Texas and Oklahoma are out of the Big 12 has given all of those programs an idea that they can, if they've got a decent team, that they're going to go in with a chance to win the conference. So I think there's, oxygen for West Virginia this year, specifically beyond just, Penn State's coming to town. I think there are high expectations for this team overall, and not just to maybe pull a one-time upset and then turn in another 8-4 season. I think people wanted to see West Virginia make a run in this Big 12. So I think that's a circumstance that maybe wasn't there last year. Joel, I want to talk about Drew Allar because, as we went through last season, that first game against West Virginia kind of ended up being his masterpiece for the year. I think, maybe you could put the Michigan State game in that same boat, but I think the whole team played well in that game. I think the West Virginia game was really Drew Allar at the center of the action in a way that we didn't see for the whole rest of the campaign. How much do we need to see him handle this environment to believe that this is a real playoff contender? And how much of that performance from last season do you think he can replicate on the road?
Yeah. In terms of the playoff situation, obviously Penn State, I think 10-2 gets you in. 9-3, you're kind of on the bubble. And at that point, it's really out of your hands, and you're kind of depending on, what other teams do, what, the resumes look like, and what the committee kind of thinks. So definitely a big game in terms of that. And again, we've seen in the past, Allar has played in some road environments, started, at Ohio State last year, but they obviously lost that game. And he was, pretty abysmal showing from Allar there, under 50% completion. And then we all know what happened with, the post-game interview kind of breaking down a little bit during media and everything like that. We have heard a lot this offseason about how Allar's taken a step forward as a leader, become more of a vocal leader in that room, and then was recently named a team captain, which is a status he didn't have last year. So I do think Allar's kind of taken strides more on the mental side than the physical side. I would say just to kind of get prepared, which I think will help him in this matchup. And he might find a little bit more success because on the road last year, there were times where he struggled, even against lesser teams. I think of a game like Northwestern or Illinois where he wasn't particularly great. And so, again, going to West Virginia, we talked about the environment that he's going to have there. It's going to be a challenge for sure. And it's kind of going to be a prove it moment for Allar. We've heard all these things all offseason about him, stepping up, taking on that leadership role within the offense. Can he actually go out and show that and lead the offense against West Virginia? Can he have the same success that he had against them last year, in the friendly confines of Beaver Stadium? And it'll be interesting to see. I'm not sure. I also think part of it is that West Virginia has improved over the offseason and even throughout last season. So I think it'll be kind of a different West Virginia squad than what Penn State saw last year. So I do think it would be hard for Allar to replicate the success he had last year, even if he has taken steps forward, just because I think the West Virginia defense is also going to be a lot tougher than what we saw last season.
21 out of 29, 325 yards, 3 touchdowns, averaged 11.2 yards per attempt last season against the Mountaineers. So, yeah, it's going to be difficult to reach. I don't think you have to do that to beat West Virginia. I just think, once you've proven you can do it once, people are going to be, wanting to see that from him because you're going to have tough road trips this year. I think, probably tougher than any average road trip that he's had to deal with. You're going to have to go to Madison, which, even if Wisconsin's not phenomenal, we've seen Penn State have to, fight hard up there. You're going to go into the LA Coliseum. I'll actually be at that game. And it was tough to get tickets for that. It's going to be a big environment. That's 90,000 people under the bright lights of Hollywood. So, there's going to be a lot of eyes on, can you handle this, Drew Allar, especially in the context of that Ohio State game a year ago. Let's flip sides. Let's talk about Garrett Greene. He was a guy that didn't have a great game in Happy Valley last year, 16 to 27, 162 yards, averaged 6 yards an attempt, no touchdowns, also no picks. But I think Neil Brown was on the Pat McAfee show this week or maybe a couple weeks ago saying he doesn't understand how Garrett Greene isn't on top 100 college football player lists. I think there's a lot more hype around him than there was a year ago. What kind of challenge do you expect him to present for this Penn State defense? And is he going to be one of the better guys they potentially see all year and making him a good test for them?
Right. Yeah. I mean, like you mentioned, he wasn't particularly impressive last season when the two teams faced off. But again, I think he's improved as well as the overall team from last year. I think he'll look a lot different this year. A bit more of a threat, and he's definitely a threat with his legs. I think his biggest strength is in the run game. He had about 750 yards last year on the ground. So again, as a passer, probably pretty average, but on the ground, a big threat. Again, he was right up there with the running backs. You look at West Virginia's leading runner; they had a couple of running backs who were around 800 yards, and then you had Garrett Greene at like 750. So he was right up there with them. So I think they're going to rely more heavily on the rushing attack. And it'll be interesting to see how Penn State handles that because West Virginia's offensive line is also a strength of the team. They lose their center, Zach Frazier, who was one of the key pieces of the team last year, arguably the best player on their team last year, but they still have some talent on that offensive line. It should be one of the strengths of the team. They've got some good running backs, and then you add Garrett Greene's rushing ability. It'll really come down to how well Penn State's able to bottle up that run. And I think with the pieces that Penn State returns in its front seven, you get your defensive tackles back. You've got Abdul Carter coming down to defensive end, and then we've got Denai Denison, a former five-star, also at defensive end. And then, linebackers, again, they're switching in Tom Allen's defense to a 4-2-5, which one fewer linebacker on the field, but you're still going to have Kobe King, Tony Rojas, so some talent there as well. So I guess I should have called it a front six, but regardless, I think the key to the game for Penn State will be trying to contain that run, especially Garrett Greene, his ability to scramble, which should make things tough for Penn State's defense.
Yeah, I think you actually answered what was going to be my next question of, how big of a challenge is this running game going to be? Because it was a challenge last year. I think they only averaged 3.7 yards per carry in the end, but I think part of that had to do with the game script and the negative way that it went for West Virginia, because they still piled up 146 yards, 81 from CJ Donaldson, 71 from Garrett Greene, 40 carries on the evening. So not terribly efficient in the bottom line, but I think we remember in those first couple drives, Joel, that they were able to move the ball and then challenge this Penn State defense a little bit. So I think that's going to really determine whether West Virginia is going to be in this game or not. If they can run the ball, I think it's going to be a game in the fourth quarter, whether Penn State's ahead by a touchdown or two. But if they can run the ball, I think it's going to be a game. If they can't, I think Penn State's going to be able to get out and cover pretty easily. Let's talk about this. What do you need to see from Penn State's running backs in this game? We've talked about how they're expected to be better than they were a year ago because of the change in the offense. I know there's been some changes in the physique this offseason. So what do you need to see from them against a real varsity opponent to believe that things are going to be different than they were for most of 2023?
Yeah, I think if you're a Penn State fan, what you really want to see is just that explosiveness come back from what we were able to see 2 seasons ago. That was obviously lacking last year. I mean, Singleton's longest run of the 2023 season was only 20 yards, which is kind of insane considering what he was able to do the year prior with all those explosive plays. That was kind of, what he was known for was those home runs. And so I think if you're Penn State, you definitely want to see that explosiveness come back. You definitely want to see, you're hoping that under Kotelnicki's new scheme, they're able to kind of unlock that, get some more big plays. And I think the key for Penn State, again, on the ground, you don't want to be having 1, 2, 3 yard runs or even negative plays. You don't want to be getting kind of behind the sticks, kind because then that allows West Virginia to stay in the game. And West Virginia, obviously, like we just touched on, is kind of a heavy running team. And so if both teams are kind of keeping it on the ground, and if Penn State's not able to pull away, it's going to be very limited possessions, probably a very low scoring affair. So if you're Penn State, you're hoping, 1 or 2 explosive plays early, kind of like what we saw last year with the Keandre Lambert-Smith 70-yard touchdown on the first drive. If you're Penn State, that's kind of the ideal scenario where, you can hit those explosive plays, you can get on the board early because, again, West Virginia, more of a running team, not really any proven commodities in the receiver room. So not necessarily built to come back from a deficit. So I think if Penn State can kind of jump out to that early lead, get some explosive plays, then they should be in a good position to kind of pull away as the game continues.
James Franklin mentioned the receivers specifically again this week as the most improved group since the spring. Scale of 1 to 10, how much are you buying what he's been selling on them since camp started? Because I think we've had this conversation a couple of times of, well, what are they supposed to say? That the receivers are worse, that the receivers aren't very good, and that's all true. But how much of it do you think is coach speak, and how much of it do you think is legit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that is kind of one of the big questions of the offseason. And just going back to that specific question, it was almost a cop-out answer because Franklin was asked which unit of the offense he felt like has taken the biggest strides this offseason. And then he mentioned wide receiver, but he also mentioned offensive line. He also mentioned quarterback. And then he said he would have mentioned tight end or running back, but he felt like they were already so good last year that they're going to maintain that, but not necessarily take a step forward. So at the end of the day, it was kind of a cop-out answer there. But yeah, he did mention the receivers first. And so and again, that's not the first time, obviously, he's mentioned them. He also started yesterday's press conference. It was interesting. He came up yesterday and he joked about getting kind of old and how his memory's fading. And he said, I forgot to mention Omari Evans during the last media when you guys asked me about the wide receivers. So he wanted to specifically throw Omari Evans out there. He's done that a few times with the wide receivers, kind of specifically mentioning guys. And you try to ask him about one player, he brings up the entire room, basically just goes down the line of how they've all been improving, how they've all looked better. So it is really difficult at times to kind of, which players are actually improving, or, you know what I mean? Because he'll kind of say the same thing about everyone. But I do tend to believe that the passing attack will be better, just because it, frankly can't get much worse.
Yeah.
Again, you lose Keandre Lambert-Smith, the team's leading receiver. He had a big game against West Virginia last year, which, obviously, if you're Penn State, you probably would have wanted to keep him there just because he's a great, talented player. But we also saw a lot of the times he was running the wrong routes, things like that. And they even, kind of benched him during the Peach Bowl after like the first few drives. We didn't see him at all. So it was kind of a weird situation there. But you bring in Julian Fleming. We've heard good things about him. Should be a good replacement there, potentially wide receiver 1, although Harrison Wallace also in that conversation. And again, Wallace had a good game against West Virginia last year as well. I think 7 catches for 70 yards, which were both career highs for him. And then he just struggled with injuries throughout the year. But I think Penn State has enough guys in that room. And I think one of the bigger issues for Penn State's receivers, whether it's Fleming, whether it's Wallace, whether it's Omari Evans, I think one of the biggest issues for the receivers has been just staying healthy and staying on the field. Well, the cure to that is you just had a whole offseason and it's week 1, so nobody's injured yet. Maybe that changes throughout the season, but as of now, Penn State's wide receiver room is kind of at full strength, which I think, just based on that alone, having Harrison Wallace healthy, having Fleming, who said he feels he's the healthiest he's ever been. He said, I think he had 2 surgeries just last season alone at Ohio State. And so he was kind of dealing with some issues there, but I think you have those 2 guys fully healthy heading into the season. And again, some other guys, Amari Evans, Liam Clifford, Kaden Saunders, who could potentially pick it up. So just because of that, I think, Penn State's wide receiver room might be in the best situation it'll be all season this year, just for this opening game. So I do expect it to pick up. And if there is kind of, a good team to do it against, West Virginia secondary, West Virginia's pass defense wasn't great last year. Should still be a weakness of the team. I know they brought in a few guys, I think through the transfer portal, but not, any huge names. I don't know if they'll take a huge step forward. And I think if you talk to West Virginia fans, they'll tell you that, the secondary is kind of the weakness of the team right now. So I think it's kind of good for Penn State to get that opportunity to exploit that weakness and kind of build some confidence.
He voluntarily, I've noticed a tone shift with him when he's talking about the non-conference schedules. He seems very jolly about this game in a way that he's typically not. I mean, I remember sitting in Ireland listening to him bellyache about having to play UCF in his first game. That was a Bill O'Brien thing for him. He's obviously made some memorable quotes bellyaching about, playing Pitt through the years, because that was another gift that I think, was late Paterno era, and then Bill O'Brien added those second couple games in 17, 18. And I think he's increasingly shown a little bit more love for the idea of playing games like this against West Virginia. He voluntarily brought up the benefits of playing Pitt. He mentioned Pitt specifically in a way that he was not prompted to ask, which is rare. Usually a Penn State coach will not say the word Pitt unless they are prompted to and kind of cornered on it. And he said, these are the benefits of playing these teams specifically. Do you think he is softening at all on the idea of scheduling some of these old Eastern rivalries from Penn State's independent days? Do you see any more daylight for a Pitt to end up back on the schedule maybe sooner than later? Or do you think he still looks at the 12-team playoff format and maybe says, we got to have an easy schedule here. We don't need these big rivalry games. Is this something you think they're going to move beyond, maybe once this West Virginia game is over?
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on something interesting with the 12-team playoff. But I do agree to your point, because I remember after the second Auburn game where Penn State went to Jordan-Hare Stadium, beat the Tigers 41-12 or whatever it was. And after the game, he was asked by the media, how much he enjoyed kind of scheduling a big marquee non-conference opponent, a team from the SEC, everything like that, or if he was kind of, encouraged to do it in the future based on how it went. And he still said he didn't like it. He said he wished that they hadn't scheduled that home and home against Auburn, which was kind of interesting considering, Penn State went 2-0 in those games, but Franklin was kind of against it, said the team kind of had to do whatever it needed to do to reach the season undefeated or with as few losses as possible. But going back to what you said about the playoff, I think it's interesting because now teams can go 11-1, 10-2, potentially even 9-3, depending on the situation, and get into the playoffs. So I think honestly, Franklin has become a little bit more lenient because he knows that, you can schedule a big team out of conference, a good test for your team. And at the end of the day, even if you lose that game, you still have a good shot of making the playoffs if you can take care of business the rest of the year. So it kind of gives you a little bit more leeway there. But yeah, that is interesting to see Franklin's tone kind of switch on that. I do think it's probably has something to do with the playoffs, but yeah, definitely interesting.
Yeah, and that's just a question we have to ask on a podcast produced by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, right? Got to talk about Pitt and Penn State when we can. The other big headline of the week, Joel, was the Pat Kraft extension. 8 years, a lot of money. Did you see the length as warranted? Given everything they're trying to do with the stadium right now, this is not going to be like an overnight thing. You want a steady hand overseeing the whole project and not 8 different people with 8 different ideas of how to get it done. Or do you look at the competitiveness of this athletic department as a whole compared to where it was, when I was in school, when you had multiple programs competing seriously for national championships, and say, it's questionable whether he should have gotten 8 full years to deal with that. Just because I think wrestling's the only really super viable program right here on a national championship level. You look at, the volleyball program has unquestionably taken a step back. Women's volleyball, the soccer teams were really good when I was in school about a decade ago. I know they're still pretty solid and solid threats, but they haven't kind of gotten through to that College Cup level since. Football is obviously something, and basketball is still searching for some answers after that. The loss of Micah Shrewsbury. What's your read on whether this was the right move or not?
Yeah. I think if you're Penn State, obviously what they wanted to do was kind of lock up Kraft, like you mentioned, long-term. Just part of it, obviously, the Beaver Stadium renovations, which aren't scheduled to be completed until 2027. So obviously you don't want to be switching athletic directors who are suddenly, changing their mind on that halfway through the construction or something like that. So part of it just kind of securing that. And again, Franklin's been at Penn State for a long time now, entering his 11th season. So obviously there's that continuity there, and he kind of values, staying at the same place for a long time and kind of building something over time. I do think it was a good move for Penn State. You mentioned kind of some of the other athletic programs, how they've been doing in terms of success. I think some of the bigger programs, men's basketball and baseball, things like that, have kind of recently hired new coaches, new head coaches under Pat Kraft, and taken some promising steps, which I think is interesting because I think Pat Kraft. I think in terms of football, I'm not sure how much has necessarily changed it, but I do think some of the other sports are kind of getting a little bit more love or a little bit more attention. So, I mean, Rob Cooper was the head coach of Penn State baseball for whatever, 10, 11, 12 years. I think they had 1 or 2 winning records in that time, right? And half the schedule comes against, Bucknell or Youngstown State or whatever, and they're losing games like that. And things like that. So it was certainly an underperforming program, I would say. And under the previous regime with Sandy Barber, it was kind of, they were just allowing that to happen. They were, okay. They were content with it. I think Pat Kraft comes in and the expectation is, he wants every team to be competitive at the highest level. Franklin has gone out of his way to compliment Kraft a lot of times. I think he's gone 3 consecutive medias where he's talked about the new football training table, which he said he never had before this year. It's a new thing that he's always wanted to get done and was finally able to get it done under Kraft. Again, the Beaver Stadium renovation is happening now. We know the Lash building recently had some upgrades. So just things like that. I think the facilities under Pat Kraft, he's willing to spend that money. Again, we're not sure how that will necessarily translate to success on the field. You would think, intuitively that it would help out. But I mean, Franklin certainly seems to like Kraft, and you could argue Franklin's kind of the most powerful, most influential person at Penn State, more than Neely Bendapudi, more than anyone like that. So when Franklin likes someone and he seems to really like Pat Kraft, I think that's always, a good sign for Pat Kraft. That's kind of where you want to be. You want to have the full support of Franklin. And I think that certainly plays a role in the fact that, Franklin seems to really like him. And Franklin's obviously locked up for a while now. Forget exactly how long his contract was. I think around 8 years as well, from a couple of years ago. So, I think he wants Kraft to be here as long as he's here, because I think he really likes what Kraft has done for the football team.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the conversation is that this is a big transition era in college sports, and is Pat Kraft the right guy for that, given that things change on a dime? And I think I'll narrow the question this way and get you out of here on this, Joel, is listen, Penn State was in bad shape in NIL about a year and a half ago after the Micah Shrewsbury departure for Notre Dame. I think they've taken a lot of good steps in the past year, but as we've talked about on this podcast already this year, they're still behind the Ohio States of the world and some of these other high dollar value programs. Do you think Pat Kraft is equipped to squeeze the most out of Penn State and maybe coax a cultural, because I think that's his biggest challenge, right? Is the cultural issue of we're not going to pay to play, and the Joe Paterno Grant experiment, all of that. That is not the world that we live in anymore. It's going to be about establishing this as a financially viable competitor on the NIL level. I think we say the word NIL is shorthand for how like paying the players, but as we know with the House settlement, there's they're going to be able to pay players directly too. NIL is going to be part of it, but it's no longer going to be all of enticing talented players to come to Happy Valley. So do you look at Pat Kraft and say this is a guy who took his lumps early on with the Shrewsbury situation, but understands the importance of changing the culture at Penn State and understanding that if you're going to maintain your status as a blue blood, it's going to require Penn State to do things it hasn't traditionally been comfortable doing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Pat Kraft's an innovative guy. I think he's willing to kind of adapt his strategy to keep up with the changing times. Obviously NIL becoming a much bigger factor now. And I think there's no reason why Penn State, can't be successful in the NIL era. Obviously a large majority of the fan base, or, a large alumni base, I should say, of whatever it is, 700,000, I think, living alumni, largest in the world. And then you look at, CEOs and things like that, because if we're being honest here, most of the NIL money is not coming from, the average person in York, PA or wherever is coming from, these big businesses, these big CEO types. And I recently saw somewhere that Penn State, I think LinkedIn ranked Penn State number 2 of any college in the country for graduating CEOs. And I think number 1 was like Harvard and number 3 was like Yale. So you have these Ivy League schools, and then there's just Penn State up there at number 2, which I thought was really interesting. So, and we've seen even with these Beaver Stadium renovations, the amount of money that Penn State has pouring in with these founders gifts, so they're calling it, of 10 million, 25 million, another 10 million dollars coming in. It's every week they're getting another massive donation to these renovations. So the money's certainly there. I think the biggest issue has just been kind of getting the fans informed about how to donate, where to go to donate, kind of what the money is going to. And so I think that's been a little bit lacking. And I think Penn State got off to a really bad start because there were about 3 or 4 different collectives, and then they've kind of merged down into Happy Valley United being the main one. And I think they've taken strides. I think there's some key figures that have kind of helped that. I know LeVar Arrington is doing some work in the NIL space to kind of help out Penn State there. So I think it's definitely a work in progress. I don't think it's where Penn State wants it to be. I don't think it's where Penn State expected it to be, when NIL first became a thing, but I think it is headed in the right direction. And I think Kraft is definitely working hard on that front, because I think he does understand, that it's going to take a really good NIL to be able to be competitive in these major sports.
Yeah, I like to tell people when I talk about NIL that the moment I knew they were taking things seriously is when I saw not just beer in the stadium, but they had those State Light beers that were benefiting Penn State NIL in Beaver Stadium last year. Things like that are like innovative steps that I think you can take with a massive fan base. And listen, I don't know if you remember, Joel, back in 2015 when they made the Joe Paterno beer, it was kind of a protest of what had happened with the scandal. But people went to the ends of the earth to buy the Joe Pa beer for like the one run they did. I think it was Pittsburgh Brewing or someone out this way that made it. But hey, get those State Lights out to beer distributors. I have a buddy who runs a beer distributor. I said, have you seen this at your wholesalers or anything? And no, they had not. So like things like that. Can you get things like that at a grassroots level distributed across the state, so that a Penn State fan can say, well, I don't have $100 to light on fire and just hand to James Franklin, but if you give me a 12th pack of decent beer, and you put a Penn State NIL label on it, am I more inclined to buy that than I am like a Miller Lite or a Bud Light or all the the mainline beers? I think a lot of fans would invest in that way. So that's going to be the question. Can Pat Kraft take those next steps on a grassroots level to boost not just NIL, I think the whole donor base to do the things that it's going to need to do in this new college football future? But Joel, I think we're over time already. So thank you for stopping by. Enjoy the trip to Morgantown. Be safe. And I'm looking forward to hearing your report. Joel will be doing a post-game video on Saturday. So if you're a Penn State fan, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Obviously, we do a lot of Steelers here. We do some Pitt, but we're going to have plenty of Penn State content. We're going to have Penn State locker room content this season coming to you from Joel. So maybe 3, 4, 5 Penn State videos a week on a Steelers-dominated channel. I think that's pretty good. So hit that subscribe button. Help us out with a like. It really helps us out in the YouTube algorithm for things like Penn State that maybe are not our main emphasis on this channel, but that we really want to get in front of as many people as possible. So those likes always help. Pop that button. And Joel, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.